Welcome to American Spectrum. I am your host, Ali Waris. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to read my favorite lines by Robert Frost, which have inspired me a great deal and which are somewhat relevant in today's setting. Two roads diverged from a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. I have often wondered, what is it like to take the road less traveled by? Why would anyone exchange a life of potential comfort and happiness to walk on fire? Why did Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, and countless others did so? Perhaps the answer to this is because they lived at a higher level of consciousness as compared to any Tom, Dick, and Harry. Today's guest, Josh Ruebner, was born and raised in America. He is the National Advocacy Director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, a national coalition of more than 380 organizations working to end U.S. support for Israel's illegal 45-year military occupation of the Palestinian West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, and to change U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine to support human rights, international law, and equality. Ruebner is a former analyst in Middle East affairs at the Congressional Research Service, which is a federal government agency providing members of Congress with policy analysis. He holds a graduate degree in international affairs from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Ruebner is the author of the forthcoming book, tentatively entitled Shattered Hopes, Obama and Quest for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. This book is being published by Warsaw Books and will be released in 2013. Ruebner's analysis and commentary on U.S. policy toward the Middle East appear frequently in media such as NBC, ABC, Nightline, C-SPAN, MSNBC, USA Today, The Hill, Los Angeles Times, Detroit Free Press, Huffington Post, Middle East Report, and now American Spectrum. With such qualifications, Josh had all the credentials to be a neoconservative who enjoy unlimited opportunities and power in America, as long as they support Israel for everything that Israel wants them to. But Josh chose the less traveled road, and now the Israeli lobby in Washington has listed Josh Ruebner's organization as an enemy of Israel. Congratulations, Josh. On November 19, 2012, I sat down with Josh Ruebner in Washington to ask him some questions, the answers to which I will share with you in this show. Please stay with us if you can. Thank you. Good afternoon, Josh. Thank you for having me here. As you know, I've come here to learn about your esteemed organization and ask you questions. I will share these answers with my subscribers on YouTube and the audience of PhillyCam, which is a public access television in Philadelphia, with which I am associated. Now, my first question is about your mission statement, which seems to be reflected in your organization's name, U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation. Could you please further elaborate?
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show, Ali. The U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation is a national coalition of nearly 400 organizations now, including many in the Philadelphia area. And our mission is to end U.S. support for Israeli military occupation toward the Palestinian West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, and also to end U.S. support for Israel's overall policies of apartheid toward the Palestinian people, and to replace that with a policy that supports human rights, international law, and equality, which we believe is really the only firm basis upon which just and lasting Israeli-Palestinian peace can be brought about.
For how long have you been associated with this campaign?
I've been associated with it since our first organizers conference, which was back in the summer of 2002.
Are you the founder of this organization?
No, I'm not the founder, although I joined the steering committee after the first conference back in 2002. That was at a time when we didn't have any staff, and it was an all-volunteer organization, and I became one of the first staff people in 2003.
Do you also have Israeli citizenship?
I have. My father was born in British Mandate era Palestine and grew up in Israel until he immigrated to the United States as a teenager. And because of Israel's immigration and citizenship laws, the son or daughter of an Israeli citizen also automatically gets Israeli citizenship. So yes, I do have Israeli citizenship as well as U.S. citizenship, being born here in the States, and I have spent some time living in Jerusalem.
Since you have lived in Israel, do you know enough about Israel to be authentic?
I think so, as authentic as anyone else, I think. In this age of instant communication and social media, it's very, very easy, I think, to have a sense of what's taking place halfway around the world, whereas before people were much more reliant upon traditional media, and media was much slower in getting the word out. So, I think I'm pretty well in touch with what's taking place there.
Josh, I'm curious to know what inspired you to get involved with this campaign?
Well, I think it's just the gross injustice that has been done to the Palestinian people by the State of Israel for the last 6+ decades. And to see what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people and to get a small sense of what it's like for Palestinians to live under really brutal and terrible and apartheid conditions, whether they live under military occupation in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, whether they're discriminated against in terms of being second-class citizens within Israel, or whether they're refugees who were ethnically cleansed from their home and denied their historic and internationally guaranteed right of return. All of these things contribute to a gross injustice against the Palestinian people that need to be rectified. And these human rights abuses and apartheid policies need to be ended in order for Israelis and Palestinians to have a chance at living in peace together. And the fact that my government, the United States, really underpins and supports all of these Israeli policies that go to oppressing the Palestinian people makes me even that much more motivated to try to counter and change what my government is doing.
Now in Philadelphia, and for that matter, the whole nation, Americans are generally unaware about the extreme human rights violations and ethnic cleansing in Israel, because the American media is extremely dishonest about reporting these facts. President Carter's book on apartheid shocked many in America, but many others knew the facts all along. So I wanted to take this occasion to ask you to portray the life of an ordinary Palestinian under the Israeli occupation.
Right. Well, right now in November of 2012, we're seeing the most brutal and violent type of conditions under which Palestinian lives in Israel's attack upon the Gaza Strip. This attack, as of this interview, has been going on for just a few days, and already over 100 Palestinians have been killed in these Israeli assaults and attacks upon the Gaza Strip. And the fact that the U.S. is providing Israel with all this sophisticated and advanced technology, both to attack Palestinians and also to knock down Palestinian rockets that are coming in to Israel, really make the United States complicit in helping Israel to achieve the things that they're doing in these attacks against the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. So, you know, to be a Palestinian in the Gaza Strip is to live under very, very difficult conditions for the past 6 years now. You've had Israel impose a full-scale land, sea, and air blockade on the Gaza Strip, a blockade which has been declared to be illegal by the United Nations because it's a form of collective punishment. In other words, Israel is trying to punish the entire civilian population of the Gaza Strip, which is now 1.7 million people, in order to punish basically the Hamas party, which is in charge of the government in Gaza. So you have a situation where Palestinians, who have nothing to do with politics, have been deprived of their right to food, for example. Israel controls how much food is let into the Gaza Strip. And according to recently released documents by the Israeli military, during the first few years of the siege of Gaza, Israel actually calculated very specifically on a caloric basis what would be the absolute minimum necessary, just barely to prevent Palestinians from starving to death. So that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing this really brutal blockade on the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Interior Minister said that the point of this attack on the Gaza Strip is to send Gaza back to the Middle Ages. And indeed, that's what we're witnessing right now. Thanks to U.S. weapons, thanks to U.S. diplomatic support, all of these innocent Palestinian civilians are being massacred as a result.
So for how long this brutality is going on, these severe punishment conditions and deprivation of food, deprivation of shelter, and bombardment, and for how long has that been going on?
Well, I think in one respect or another, these types of attacks on the Palestinian people have been going on for more than 6 decades now. And if you look back at the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel was established on the basis of ethnically cleansing most indigenous Palestinians from their homes and lands. More than 500 Palestinians were razed to the ground. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were killed and massacred in that war of ethnic cleansing to create the quote-unquote Jewish state. And so ever since 1948, you know, you've had various degrees of intensity in terms of the violence that's directed against the Palestinian people by Israel. But throughout this process, one thing has remained constant. Israel has always wanted the most land possible with the least number of Palestinians on it as possible. And so what we're seeing today is a continuation of that very long-term process of ethnic cleansing. We're seeing Palestinians in the West Bank being pushed out. We're seeing Israel preparing to annex what's known as Area C of the West Bank, and a large stretch of territory between the Jordan River and the West Bank. And all of these things are designed to fragment Palestinian territory into ever-shrinking islands, to increase the economic pressure on Palestinians to get them to leave, and to make daily life simply unbearable by continuing to expropriate their land, chop down their olive trees, take their water resources. And all of these things are being underwritten by U.S. military aid and U.S. governmental support of Israel's actions.
How do the Israelis justify such action on their part in terms of human rights violations and just general decency and humanity?
Well, they try to play the victim. They try to make it seem as if they are the aggrieved party rather than the aggressor. They always claim that whatever they're doing is in self-defense and so forth. But what we've seen over the past, I'd say, 5 years, and especially in the last 4 years since Operation Cast Lead, when Israel massacred more than 1,400 Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in just 3 weeks, is this kind of narrative really crumbling. And this discourse of Israel being the eternal victim of the Palestinian people is just not holding a lot of water anymore. Even here within the United States, that's becoming a position that's more and more difficult to defend, and which is becoming more and more laughable, really, because everyone can see for themselves exactly what Israel is doing. You mentioned before the media. The reality is that people don't need to filter their information through the mainstream media anymore in order to get a clear sense of what's going on. You can get on Twitter, you can get on YouTube, you can get on Facebook, and you can hear directly from Palestinians in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, who are at the end of these attacks by Israel. And people are learning for themselves, seeing for themselves, and it's becoming more and more difficult, I think, for Israel to sort of keep the lid on the narrative, and they're really losing control of the discourse.
What is your modus operandi in being able to accomplish so much success? I know you travel through the country educating people in seminars and fundraising events. In fact, we met in 2004 in Houston during one of these events. Tell me what else you do in making things happen.
In 2005, more than 170 different Palestinian civil society organizations issued a global call for campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, both against Israel and against corporations and institutions that were profiting from Israel's human rights abuses of Palestinians. We responded by endorsing that and by running campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel and corporations here in the United States. So we've had an ongoing campaign to boycott and divest from Caterpillar, for example, because Caterpillar is literally profiting from Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes. Israel's demolished, I think, upwards of 27,000 Palestinian homes since it occupied the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip in 1967. So you've had this huge displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians off of their land, and Caterpillar is getting rich off of it. And so we've worked for years to make sure that there are campaigns of boycott and divestment against Caterpillar for this war profiteering, and now we're starting to see that campaign pay off. So for example, Caterpillar was delisted from a Morgan Stanley social responsible investment fund earlier in 2012 and lost $73 million in investments.
And was that this year?
That was earlier this year in 2012. So we run boycott and divestment campaigns against corporations like Caterpillar, like Motorola, which is profiting from Israel's military occupation by providing communications equipment to Israeli settlements and to the Israeli military. Companies like the French multinational Veolia, which is complicit in running apartheid transportation networks for Israeli settlers, not for Palestinians. Palestinians aren't allowed on these buses. So it's campaigns like that and getting institutions to boycott and divest from those corporations. And those corporations are definitely starting to feel the economic pinch of engaging in this kind of war profiteering off of Israel's human rights abuses of the Palestinian people. So that's in terms of boycott and divestment. In terms of sanction, as I mentioned before, the United States government is enabling Israel to commit all of these human rights abuses against Palestinians. So what we're doing is we have a long-standing organizing campaign to end U.S. military aid to Israel. It's annual more than $3 billion appropriation that the U.S. taxpayer gives. And our research found, for example, that in the last decade, the United States transferred to Israel more than 670 million weapons. So the United States is complicit in absolutely everything the Israeli military does. It's our bullets, it's our tanks, it's our helicopters, it's our missiles, it's our aircraft. Every human rights abuse that's being committed by Israel against Palestinians is made in the USA and paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. So we're working on a sanctions campaign to get the United States to stop its military aid to Israel, which it should do because there are U.S. laws, for example, that say these weapons can only be used for legitimate self-defense and for internal security. But that's not how they're being used. They're being used to commit human rights abuses against Palestinians. So we're working on these types of BDS campaigns. And at the same time that we do that, we're also challenging current U.S. governmental policies, whether it's Congress or the State Department or what the United States is doing in the UN to protect Israel and to provide it with impunity.
So, what's your level of success in working with Congress on these issues?
It's still very difficult, to be quite honest. And the stage when we get to the stage of actually changing policy will be very, very close to succeeding in our mission. So policy change, I think, will be the last step. And, you know, politicians don't do things because there's a moral imperative behind it. They do things because people demand it of them. And the political calculus that most members of Congress have right now is that there's much more worry for me politically if I stand up and if I oppose what Israel's doing, even if I know it to be wrong, than there is if I stand up and say I support Palestinian human rights. So we're out to change that political calculus and change that political equation in order to demonstrate that there is growing support for Palestinian human rights in this country, that there is a growing awareness that it's our government's policies that are supporting and enabling Israel's human rights abuses of Palestinians. So as this movement grows through successes in education, through successes in boycott and divestment, we'll eventually get to the stage where we're able to affect policy change. That being said, you know, there are things we do to try to change policy in the here and now, sort of on the margins, but, you know, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that we're able to pass legislation because we're not at that point yet.
Please tell me, if you would, how much support do you get from a common American for your cause? I mean, not only in terms of money, but also volunteer work for the campaign.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on what's taking place and what the action is. But I'd say in general, what we've seen over the past 5 years or so is a huge growth in both the numbers of people involved and in terms of the effectiveness of the actions. So we keep hearing a mixed message from Israel's supporters. On the one hand, they say, oh, the movement for boycott and divestment and sanctions is totally ineffective. It doesn't matter. They're not having any victories. But then if you look at some of the internal things that are said within these organizations, and the head of the American Israel Public Affairs Committee said it best, I think, 3 years ago to AIPAC's annual conference, and he said something to the effect that this movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is everywhere. It's invaded mainstream institutions, it's invaded the campuses, it's invaded churches, and so forth. And so what Israel's supporters are very, very worried about right now is Israel becoming a pariah state in the United States, akin to the way South Africa was viewed in the days of apartheid here in the United States. And now, South Africa didn't get to that pariah status on its own. It got to that status because thousands and thousands of activists around the country were pushing these campaigns of boycott, divestment, and sanctions back in all the way from the 1950s up to the 1980s. So, you know, we're in that stage right now, but we're having huge successes. Campuses have divested. Student Senate bodies have called for divestment. And we're seeing now that, you know, corporations are losing tens of millions of dollars in investments because of these policies. So we're definitely on the right track. Israel's definitely becoming more and more of an outcast and a pariah status. And, you know, more and more I think the U.S. policy is becoming clear that it's built on fear, it's built on corruption, It's built on intimidation. It's not built on popular support for Israel or love for what Israel's doing.
Josh, I'm sure that you heard about the book, The Israel Lobby, published in 2007 by John Mersheimer and Stephen Walt of Harvard. Do you have any disagreements with that book? Do you have any point of disagreement?
I think it's very clear that there is a huge and important Israel lobby that virtually makes policy on Israel-Palestinian issues, and also to a large extent sets policy for the United States to the Middle East in general. I think to dispute that charge is to be totally disconnected from reality. The New York Times once called AIPAC the most effective foreign policy lobby in the country. And it is. It is. It's the largest. It's the most effective. But that doesn't mean that what they're doing and the views that they're propagating are meeting with any success. Like I said before, it's a lot of bullying, it's a lot of intimidation, it's a lot of censorship to try to keep U.S. politicians from expressing concern about the direction of U.S. policy. So yeah, it's there, and it's certainly helping to shape and direct U.S. policy toward Israel and the Palestinians, no doubt. I mean, literally, AIPAC writes a lot of the legislation that Congress passes. They literally write it, and they send it to an office, and the office introduces it, and it's voted on that same day.
Yes, the problem is that the lobby, the Israeli lobby, has been using the carrot and stick policy. That is, if you are with them, if you are going to support them, whether you are a politician or a journalist or whatever, and they are going to help you. They are going to give you opportunities, business opportunities, advertisement, commercials, and whatnot. And if you are a politician, they are going to fund your campaign, and they'll support you as long as you submit a declaration that you are with them. But if you are against them, then they will see to it that you are destroyed. If you run an election, then your opponent will be financed, heavily financed, until you are totally eliminated. And this has happened to many very famous politicians like Paul Findlay, whom you know very well, and he was a 30-year congressman, and he was destroyed, just destroyed. And Charles Percy, who was a senator from Illinois, he always supported Israel for everything, except that once he supported the granting of AWACS to Saudi Arabia, and that infuriated AIPAC, and then they brought him down. And he himself said that on 60 Minutes, Charles Percy, he is died now, the late Charles Percy. And so what my concern is that, and this is a foreign country interfering in our elections, in our internal matters, and it's okay with everybody. And the reason they can do it because they have an exemption from registering as a foreign agent. Every person, like if I want to say I'm an agent for India, or I want to help India in certain things, then I have to register myself as an agent. Otherwise, it will be a crime. But they don't have to do that. So they have everybody, every Tom, Dick, and Harry has become their agent, and they can use anybody, anytime. The Justice Department is full of pro-Israeli lawyers, and they get promoted, they get federal judgeships and all that. Totally incompetent people, and there are three spies, three Israeli spies who were convicted, and they did not see a single day in jail, not one day. Person who passed America's military secrets for 30 years was fined only, and was convicted of that. He was fined only $50,000. which he gave the next day. And that is, I'm talking about Bin Ami Kaddish, who just died last April. So then same thing with Larry Franklin, who was a Department of Defense analyst, and he passed defense intelligence secrets, and he didn't see a single day in jail. He was given 14 years after his conviction, but the judge then changed it to 3 months house arrest. Is that I mean, is that justice? I mean, my intelligence company, my intelligence is being compromised. My country's intelligence has been compromised. Who the hell that judge is? He should be impeached. He should be. This is a high treason crime, to help any other country, and all these things. So what I'm trying to say is that all American institutions are being destroyed like termites. This is akin to an infestation of termites. They're hollowing the whole structure, and this makes me very, very disappointed. Very angry, because what the hell you are doing to this country?
Well, I think where I would disagree with you a bit is not that the Israel lobby has corrupted U.S. institutions. I think that those institutions have been corrupt and problematic, and that they've taken advantage of that situation. So I don't think it's fair to say that the U.S. judiciary is great except for the influence that the Israel lobby has on it. The Israel lobby didn't tell the U.S. judiciary to put in concentration camps Japanese Americans during World War II. The Israel lobby didn't tell the Supreme Court to uphold slavery and say that people who were enslaved were less than human beings. So, let's not pretend that these are perfect institutions. By any stretch of the imagination, they've made terrible decisions over the years, and they still make terrible decisions today based on things that have little or nothing to do with the Israel lobby as well. So when we talk about the influence in the electoral area, we have a very corrupt system of government right now. We have a system of government in which corporations can pay unlimited amounts of money into the electoral arena to try to get their candidate elected. And the Supreme Court decision, again, this is another terrible Supreme Court decision that had little or nothing to do with the Israel lobby, was the Citizens United case, which allowed for this unlimited flow of corporate money into campaigns. But here's where the corruption of U.S. political institutions runs up against the limits of what the Israel lobby is actually able to do and to accomplish, and how they are able or not able to successfully leverage these opportunities. So in this most recent election of 2012, you had Sheldon Adelson, one of the wealthiest Americans who makes his money off of casinos and so forth, publicly say that he was willing to spend $100 million to defeat Obama because Obama was not pro-Israel. That was his avowed reason for supporting first the candidacy of Newt Gingrich and then the candidacy of Mitt Romney. But you know what? And I don't know what the final numbers are because they're not yet in, but he spent at least $50 million that I've seen so far, and his money didn't make one difference.
That backfired, in fact.
Not one difference. So yes, money plays a very important role in the American political system, but I think what we saw in the 2012 election is that the Israel lobby is actually more bark than bite. Yes, they can take out a candidate who is weak. They can take out an incumbent who has criticized Israel if they're having their own issues in terms of being reelected. But for the stalwarts who have been in there for a long time and who do criticize Israel occasionally, they're not necessarily able to take them out at will. So I think I think it's actually disempowering to people who want to change this policy to sort of, puff up the Israel lobby to mythic proportions, because it's not. It's really not of mythic proportions. It is big and it is powerful, But I tell you what, we're running an ad campaign right now in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in conjunction with a local church in that city. And on the interior of all 98 buses in Chapel Hill, we are running an advertisement that says, "Be on our side, we're on the side of peace and justice, and U.S. aid to Israel." And it has a picture of an Israeli and a Palestinian with that message. And they're actually people who believe this. And so the local Israel lobby mobilized to try to get these ads taken down, and they tried to get it past the city council a number of times and have failed. And so I talked to a city councilor and I said, "How many calls of opposition have you got? What is this great pressure that you've received?" And she told me it was a handful. A handful. Well, we have more than a handful of supporters. And, so yes, there's a lot of machinations that go on behind the scenes. Yes, there's a lot of people in high places who have access to people who make the decisions. But the reality is that we shouldn't set up the Israel as more than it actually is. It can be combated, it can be confronted, and the policies that it's pursuing can be defeated.
Josh, you just mentioned that there's a shift. There's a growing shift and growing pattern of more freedom for people to speak about Israel, or there are more ways to do it now as compared to before. Could you please elaborate on that?
I think what you've seen right now is a shift in public discourse. You've seen a shift in the mainstream media's coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you've seen a shift within mainstream institutions about how to relate to this issue. So, for example, there was a time in the not too distant past when it was difficult, if not impossible, for Palestinians and Palestinian Americans to break through to the mainstream media in this country, whether it was talk shows or op-eds in major papers. That era is done and gone. Not only can Palestinians break through to the mainstream media, but they can also have their voices stand alone and not have to be quote-unquote balanced by Israel's perspective. So that's a huge, huge important factor in this changing discourse. And you can see how these changes in the media are reflected at the popular level. For example, what took place at the Democratic National Convention this summer, I think, was very, very revealing. The chair tried to push through a change in the platform that would have called for U.S. support for Jerusalem being the eternal undivided capital of Israel, and called for a voice vote on the floor, and failed 3 times to get that vote. And it was clear that there was an absolute uproar on the floor of the Democratic National Convention opposed to this notion that the U.S. should be taking these biased, one-sided positions. So, we're starting to see things like that. We're starting to see churches move from simply declaring in resolution after resolution that they want to see peace, that they believe in justice and so forth, and actually moving into the more active sphere of now boycotting Israeli settlement products, for example, which is something that the Methodist and the Presbyterian Church agreed to do this year. So we're seeing all these changes in the media, within the political parties at the grassroots level, and within mainstream institutions. And, this is exactly what happened with ending U.S. support for South Africa. Yeah. South Africa used to be, one of the United States' best allies on the continent, and was seen as a bulwark against communist expansion on the continent and so forth. And what we saw in the history of ending U.S. support for apartheid in South Africa was that the policy changes were preceded by exactly these kind of shifts in discourse, in media coverage, in changes in mainstream institutions. So that's why I can sit here today, and even though I'm very dispirited and upset by the fact that Israel is currently massacring Palestinians in the Gaza Strip as we speak, nevertheless, we're making progress. and what we're doing is well on the way toward changing those U.S. policies.
Now, what kind of affiliations do you have in the U.S., and what other organizations are willing to support you in your goals and in your objectives?
Well, we're a national coalition of nearly 400 groups, and we have member groups all over the country, I think in 46 or 47 different states of the Union. So really what's inspiring is that people at the grassroots level from all different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds are coming together to say enough of U.S. support for Israeli occupation and apartheid toward the Palestinian people. We need a new policy. We need to engage in campaigns of boycott and divestment and sanctions against Israel and corporations that profit from its human rights abuses of Palestinians, because the politicians have failed. And they'll continue to fail as long as they have this mistaken paradigm of there being a quote-unquote peace process. There is no peace process. You don't need 20 years of talks and negotiations in order to have peace.
Yeah,
what you need is political will. And you can't keep jamming the square peg into the round hole and expecting that you'll achieve a different result. And that's what the United States is trying to do. It's continually trying to engage in more negotiations, more peace process for the sake of trying to jam this square peg into the round hole. And nobody believes it anymore. So we need an alternative approach, and that alternative approach is through the strategy of boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a means to eventually changing U.S. policy.
Something that I'm curious about, Josh, is why there is very little activity over here in the United States, as opposed to the hotspot where everybody is concentrating. I mean, why don't we have a very strong group over here that is willing to cut this umbilical cord, because Israel is getting its lifeblood from America, and you have more opportunities in attacking these ties, over here in USA, as opposed to in Israel, because that area is controlled by Israel, and the Palestinian land in Gaza and all that is controlled by them. So, but here we are in the United States, and we should be able to try we should have a strategy over here how to remove this parasite, from the host, because we can do a number of things. We can put all these politicians on notice that, look here, if you are not going to think in terms of not going to think for the betterment of the country, and if you keep sacrificing American interest over Israeli, we are going to unseat you, and then you will never come back. And let's make them as pariahs, as traitors, and they are traitors. Then we have to do something to make elections, as we have to get public funding for the elections, because that's one thing that they use as the most effective tool. They give money to the politicians, and politicians are afraid. We have to have some kind of a publicly funded media, like BBC, and if they want to run their own media, that's fine, but there should be at least one or two television stations which are publicly funded, and they should be very objective. So these are the things we should have done long time ago, but we haven't done it. So could you please elaborate on that?
Well, the ties are very, very deep, and they run both ways. So, for example, if you look at U.S. war making in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past decade, you'll see that a lot of Israeli military technology was deployed by the U.S. military in terms of drones, in terms of equipment that's supposed to protect against IEDs, etc. And a lot of Israeli weapons manufacturers have opened U.S. subsidiaries so that they can compete and partner up with U.S. domestic weapons manufacturers to win these huge contracts from the Pentagon for deals that have nothing to do with Israel. So I would say what President Eisenhower termed the military-industrial complex, that is becoming very, very intertwined with Israel's military-industrial complex. So when I hear politicians or Israel's supporters speak about shared values between the countries, I think in some respects those are correct assumptions because, look, this country was founded on the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants of this country. What became the United States and its government killed more than 90% of the indigenous inhabitants of this country in order to establish the United States of America, and of course built it up upon a system of slavery. And while Israel doesn't have that same history of slavery, it certainly shares that same history of ethnically cleansing as much of the land as possible of as many indigenous inhabitants as possible.
They also have apartheid, history.
Well, absolutely. We have apartheid history in this country and in the not too distant past as well. I mean, when you look at Jim Crow in the South and you had both formal and informal segregation and discrimination against African Americans, a lot of those laws are replicated in Israel against Palestinian citizens, not to mention those Palestinians who live under military occupation. And so, when the United States goes and throws its weight around the world to advance its empire and fights all of these distant wars, yeah, a lot of the tactics and the strategies are very similar to what Israel's doing to the Palestinians right now in terms of trying to bomb them into the Middle Ages, as the Israeli Interior Minister would like to do. So, when you talk about values, I think it's a mixed bag because on the one hand, in recent decades, I think we have seen a deterioration in humanity's driven values in this country. More inequality, more corporate power, more empire, more warfare. All of those things are true. But I think also at the same time it's true that we've had more diversity, more inclusion, more acceptance of other people's lifestyles that might differ from mine or yours. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, I think, in terms of where we're going as a country. But, if the Occupy movement from last year taught us anything, is that there is still a very vibrant grassroots in this country that's opposed to these types of deteriorating values that you mentioned. And we here at the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation have always seen ourselves as part of the struggle for a more progressive United States of America, a more progressive United States of America that supports people's internationally guaranteed human rights both abroad and at home. Because if we look at the policies that are supporting Israeli occupation and apartheid toward the Palestinian people, what we're seeing is that the budgetary choices made are giving money and putting it in the pockets of U.S. weapons manufacturers at the expense of meeting community needs right here at home in terms of affordable housing, in terms of health care, in terms of education. All of these things, access to these things, are universally guaranteed rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we see as we spend more and more of our country's budget on the military, on empire, on funding Israeli occupation and apartheid, we have less and less money to fund human rights and human needs here at home. So we definitely see ourselves as part of this broader struggle to reorient the way our country makes its budgetary decisions, how it spends its money, and how it takes care of people both here and abroad.
You just mentioned something which I never heard before. That is, the United States is dependent on Israel for certain areas in defense strategies and military equipment. Could you please elaborate?
Well, there are a lot of partnerships between U.S. and Israeli weapons manufacturers. So, for example, Boeing might make the fighter jet, and an Israeli company will make the avionics that go on it, or will provide the electronics for the guidance system for the missile that's attached to the plane. It's things like that, and it's also things like drones. For example, drones are an Israeli technology that was first developed back in the 1970s and developed in this country by an Israeli expat. And what we're seeing right now, the types of drone strikes where the U.S. is committing these gross human rights abuses in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in Yemen, Somalia, Eritrea, what have you, all these places where, or sorry, Djibouti, I should say, not Eritrea, all these places where U.S. drones are flying from and killing people and even killing U.S. citizens. A lot of that is Israeli technology that's gone into creating those drones. So like I said, there's a lot of interpenetration, and taking on the power of weapons manufacturers in the U.S. political system, I think, is an imperative for anyone who believes in human rights, anyone who believes in peace and justice around the world, because you have a situation right now where nearly 60% of the U.S. discretionary budget is devoted to the military and for fighting and for giving money to other countries to fight their wars and occupations. And that leaves very little left over to take care of the human needs of people in this country, while the 1% types who are running these weapons corporations are getting rich off of it.
Josh, as we talked for quite some time, that there are some positive things happening, and there are things on the horizon which look very promising, and media is opening up, like RT television is operating right here in the United States, and they are always talking about Israeli situation, and then we have YouTube and internet, and like this interview would be uploaded on YouTube, and people would know. So given all these indications, what is your level of optimism on a 0 to 10 scale that we are close to reaching the tipping point, or in our lifetime we will see a good change? I mean, there's a big difference between your lifetime and my lifetime, but I mean, in the near future, what do you expect?
My optimism level is always a 10. It has to be a 10. You have to believe that what you're doing is contributing in a positive direction, and you have to believe that your strategy is based on sound historical precedent, and that what could be done in ending U.S. support for apartheid in South Africa can also be done for ending apartheid toward the Palestinian people practiced by Israel. It's going to be a much more difficult struggle for sure, because South Africa didn't have nearly the propaganda arm that Israel does in the United States. But nevertheless, we are very encouraged, I think, by the victories that we're seeing, by the changes in discourse. And really, how much longer can Israel continue to oppress the Palestinian people and to practice apartheid against them and to continue massacring them and expect the United States to support it? It's not going to be much longer.
Let me ask you this, Josh. You mentioned about the complexity of the relationship between Israel and US, their mutual ventures, their partnerships, and their religious ties, whatnot. But what about Europe? Why does Europe support Israel so unreasonably and so overwhelmingly? Europe is quite diverse as opposed to US, and they should have a better understanding, and they are more open to their system is better than American system. So,
well, Europe, I think, is somewhat fractured on the issue. During last fall, when the Palestinians attempted to get full membership in the United Nations, it was clear that Europe was divided over the question of whether Palestine should be admitted as a member of the UN or not. And later this month in November, Palestinians are expected again to press the UN to upgrade their status to what's known as a non-member state. And we'll see how many European votes they get. I expect it'll be at least some. But, you know, if you look at the diplomatic comings and goings, you know, the U.S. nominally has this quote-unquote quartet structure to manage the peace process, where you have the U.S., the European Union, Russia, and the UN as four supposedly co-equal partners. And it's quite clear from Palestine's version of the WikiLeaks, the Palestine Papers, which were leaked to Al Jazeera, it's quite clear from those documents that the EU is very, very upset by how the United States has sidelined them, how the United States has prevented any alternative leadership, and so forth. So, you know, notwithstanding any transoceanic ties that exist between the United States and Europe, I do think there are huge differences of opinion in terms of approach. And there are many problematic aspects to European policy toward Israel and the Palestinian people, but it's far better than U.S. policy, that's for sure.
Sometimes I wonder why is that the Palestinians are not as articulate and effective in this mission as, for example, you, Amy Goodman, Norman Finkelstein, etc. At least I don't know too many Muslim advocacy groups such as yours. Why so?
Well, I wouldn't agree with that statement at all. I know many, many phenomenal Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims who are doing amazing work to try to change this situation. You know, look, I have a certain amount of privilege being a white male and being Jewish to speak out on this issue that other people don't necessarily have. I'm not worried about the FBI coming in and arresting me. I'm not worried about being taken off to Guantanamo Bay. But my Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim friends do have those concerns and considerations, because there is still a lot of repression that faces them for engaging in this type of activism. But despite all of that repression, there are still many phenomenal, especially amongst the younger generations, of activists who are doing amazing work, both within these communities and in the broader American political context. And that, I think, is why the Israel lobby is so worried. I think it's why this Islamophobia has been peddled in large measure by Israel's supporters, because they see the increasing integration of diverse peoples into the fabric of the United States. And if you need any proof of that, just look at the results of the 2012 election and how traditional constituencies are becoming less and less important for politicians to get elected. So the Israel lobby is not dumb. They understand the writing on the wall. They understand that the demographics and the politics of this country are changing, and they're very scared by it. So they're trying to do all that they can to discredit and delegitimize anyone coming from those communities who are trying to stand up and do the same type of organizing and educating work that I'm doing.
Well, Josh, thank you for spending this afternoon with me. I did learn many new things, which I'm sure would be new for the audience of this show as well.
Great. Thank you very much for having me on your show.